On Christmas Eve in Covina, California, a family gathered to celebrate the holidays. They were expecting joy, laughter, and tradition, but when the door opened, it wasn't just a visitor. It was a man dressed as Santa, armed with weapons and fire. By the time the night was over, 9 people were gone, and the world would never forget. Christmas Eve should have been a night filled with warmth, celebration, and love. In Covina, California, the Ortega family had been gathering for this holiday tradition for years, a night where multiple generations came together under the same roof. The house on Crest Drive glowed with festive lights. Music drifted from speakers, and laughter carried down the street. For neighbors, it was the sound of normal life, a joyful reminder that the world could still feel familiar. Inside, the party was already in full motion. Children played with toy cars and dolls, darting between adults weaving conversation and food platters. The kitchen smelled of tamales, sweetbread, cinnamon, and coffee. Someone was wrapping last-minute gifts on the dining table, while others danced, teased, or simply sat back enjoying the comfort that only family can provide. It was one of those nights where you don't check the door before opening it. One of those nights where the sound of a doorbell doesn't raise suspicion. It raises excitement, especially for the children. So when the bell finally rang, no one paused. No one hesitated. No one asked, "Who could that be?" Instead, an 8-year-old girl ran toward the entryway, breathless with excitement. She wasn't expecting danger. She was expecting Santa. And in the hallway, framed perfectly by the glow of Christmas lights and a tinsel-wrapped doorway, there he was, a man dressed head to toe in a Santa Claus suit, red velvet coat, white gloves, black boots, even a classic wide belt and buckle. His beard looked real enough. The costume was convincing. For a split second, the little girl smiled, the way only children can. Foolhardy, unguarded, trusting. But Santa didn't lift his hand to wave. He didn't step forward to hug her. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached under the red fabric of his suit, and the first flash of metal gleamed under the hallway light. There was no warning, no words, no hesitation. The sound of the first shot shattered the holiday warmth like glass hitting concrete. The bullet struck the little girl near her cheek, and she fell instantly. Screams erupted, echoing through the house. People dropped their plates, ducked behind furniture, ran toward bedrooms or toward exits, stumbling in panic. "Get down!" someone shouted. But panic spreads faster than clear instructions, and fear turns a crowded room into chaos. Within seconds, the living room, once filled with music and conversation, became a scene of disorder. The man dressed as Santa stepped calmly into the space, raising a 9mm handgun in each hand. His movements were deliberate, controlled, mechanical. He fired again. And again. Witnesses later said he didn't look enraged. He didn't look emotional. He looked purposeful, as if he had rehearsed the scene in his mind long before stepping into that doorway. Family members scrambled. Some tried to shield children. Others pushed relatives toward windows or hallways. A few attempted to confront him, to rush him, but they didn't get close. Gunfire echoed through the house. Glass shattered. People screamed names, desperate cries for mothers, fathers, siblings. And yet the man in the Santa suit showed no hesitation, no mercy, no flicker of doubt. Then the horror deepened, because the guns weren't the end of his plan. Near his feet sat a large, ribbon-wrapped package, one nobody noticed when he stepped inside. It looked like a gift box, large and festive, decorated in holiday paper. But it wasn't a present. It was a device, homemade, engineered, and built with a single intention: destruction. After the shooting stopped, silence didn't return. The Santa-clad attacker set down his weapons and kneeled beside the box. He removed the wrapping, opened the lid, and lifted a metal nozzle connected to a tank hidden inside. Then, without a word, he pressed the trigger. A stream of accelerant sprayed across furniture, carpet, and people struggling to escape. The smell of gasoline saturated the air. Someone shouted, "Fire!" He's setting fire. Within seconds, flames ignited, consuming everything in their path. Curtains erupted. Clothing caught fire. Christmas ornaments melted before they could hit the ground. Heat filled the room faster, than anyone could comprehend. Smoke rose thick and black, swallowing the ceiling first, then pouring downward. The fire grew violently, fueled by the accelerant and the dry holiday decorations. Many tried to flee through windows or back doors. Some escaped, injured and traumatized. Others were trapped in rooms filling with smoke and heat. Outside, neighbors saw flames rising and heard screams piercing the night. Several began calling 911. Inside, the man in the Santa suit stood amidst the burning chaos for one final moment, watching the scene like someone closing a chapter. Then he turned and walked out the front door. It didn't take long for the Covina Fire Department to arrive, but by the time crews battled their way into blaze, the house was already heavily engulfed. The structure weakened rapidly. Flames turned ceilings into ash, memories into debris, photographs into dust. Firefighters fought for hours. And when the flames finally died, what was left was not a home, but a crime scene. Inside the charred remains, responders discovered a horrific reality. The attack had taken lives. Some victims were found near exits, others near furniture where they sought shelter. The quiet street was no longer ordinary. It became a scene of grief, shock, and questions. Who would do this? Why? And where was he now? Police began interviewing surviving witnesses, those who escaped, injured and shaken. Despite the chaos, several details repeated clearly. Santa, guns, fire, and one name, Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, a former family member, a man whose marriage to Sylvia, a member of the Ortega family, had ended not long before the attack. Almost immediately, investigators realized this was a spontaneous act. It had been planned. Every detail, the weapons, the fuel device, the disguise, pointed toward premeditation. But as law enforcement mobilized to locate him, another shock wave was waiting. He wouldn't be found alive. Hours later, officers found Pardo's vehicle, not far from his brother's home. Inside, evidence hinted at something chilling, a possible escape plan. There were maps, ammunition, and supplies, suggesting he originally intended to flee. But something changed. When authorities entered the residence where he was last seen, they found him dead, the victim of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Burns covered portions of his body, injuries likely sustained when the device ignited the fire. The suspect was gone, but the story was far from over, because now the world wanted answers. Why did a seemingly average man, a former aerospace worker, a partner, a neighbor, walk into a family gathering dressed as Santa and unleash terror? Was it heartbreak, revenge, mental collapse, or something darker? Investigators began digging into his past, and what they found revealed a troubling trail of resentment, financial pressure, emotional fractures, and escalating bitterness. The attack hadn't appeared from nowhere. It had been growing, quietly, patiently, until Christmas Eve became the day it finally surfaced. Long before the doorbell rang that Christmas Eve, long before the flames, the screams, and the name Bruce Jeffrey Pardo became synonymous with horror, there were signs. Not loud ones. Not the kind that neighbors report or co-workers whisper about. No. These were the quiet fractures, the subtle shifts, the slow unraveling that no one recognized as danger until it was too late. To understand what happened inside the Ortega home, investigators knew they had to follow the path backward, to the relationship that once connected Pardo to the family he later destroyed. And it began with a love story that no one thought would end in blood. Years earlier, Bruce met a woman named Sylvia Ortega. She was warm, grounded, social, deeply connected to her family. She loved gatherings, traditions, and the small joys that make a home feel alive. Bruce, by contrast, was quieter, methodical, intelligent. He worked as an engineer in the aerospace field, a career that suggested structure, discipline, and stability. He owned a home, earned a solid income, and appeared, at least on the surface, reliable. When the couple married, the Ortega family welcomed him. Holidays were shared, birthdays celebrated, and photos were taken. The type you frame, the type you believe will one day sit beside others marking chapters of a long life together. For a while, there were no signs anything was wrong. But beneath the surface, small tensions had begun forming. Tensions that would later become the fuel for everything that followed. Money became one of the first cracks. Bruce enjoyed appearing financially successful, and he made decisions that reflected image rather than practicality. He purchased luxury items, made expensive choices, and avoided compromise. But when expenses rose and the marriage entered everyday reality, bills, responsibilities, shared expectations, something changed in him. He became defensive, irritated, sometimes cold. Sylvia began noticing patterns, not only in finances, but in behavior. Arguments weren't disagreements. They were battles for control. Mistakes weren't inconveniences. They were personal insults. There was an emotional rigidity to Bruce that made conflict feel dangerous even when voices weren't raised. Looking back, some family members would describe him as a man who needed the world to comply, not collaborate. As tension deepened, distance grew between the couple. Small moments, misunderstandings, disappointments, began stacking brick by brick, forming a wall they no longer bothered to climb. What had once been partnership became routine. What had once been affection became obligation. And eventually, the marriage reached a breaking point. When Sylvia filed for divorce, it wasn't impulsive. It was a result of months of emotional exhaustion. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vindictive. She was done. The divorce proceedings were tense. Property, finances, spousal support, everything became a negotiation that felt, to Bruce, like an assault on his identity. He didn't just lose a partner. He lost control. And some people don't accept loss. Some people turn it into obsession. Once the separation became official, Bruce distanced himself from the Ortega family entirely. He stopped speaking to Sylvia. He withdrew from mutual friends. The connection that had once made him part of their world severed sharply. To the Ortega family, this was closure. To Bruce, it was humiliation. Bills continued, legal obligations remained, and instead of moving on, he built resentment, layering every memory, every conversation, every perceived slight into something much larger and darker than the original dispute. He spoke little about it publicly, but privately, something was happening. He was rehearsing, not emotionally, tactically. Friends later recalled small moments that didn't seem important at the time. A sudden interest in weapons, comment about injustice, a fixation on the divorce settlement, a growing bitterness that seemed to have no outlet. None of it pointed directly to violence, but together, in hindsight, the pattern was unmistakable. Bruce was preparing, not with panic, not with desperation, with calculation. Investigators later discovered receipts, documented, dated, and organized for the weapons used during the attack. These weren't impulsive buys or emotionally charged decisions. The purchases were spaced out over months. Multiple handguns, ammunition, synthetic materials, tools, and the Santa suit. The suit wasn't bought near Christmas. It had been ordered and stored earlier. Alterations suggested intent. The costume was modified to help conceal weapons and equipment beneath the fabric. When detectives examined his workspace, they found something else: sketches, notes, measurements written with precision, plans of devices that required technical understanding, patience, and time. This wasn't rage. This was preparation. Outwardly, Bruce appeared calm. He attended social events. He visited stores. He interacted with people politely. Nothing in his demeanor showed that he was constructing a plan to kill. Psychologists reviewing the case later described this period as the emotional freeze, when a person no longer reacts emotionally to pain, but instead processes it as a mission. There was no second-guessing, no hesitation. His actions weren't escalating. They were aligning. Piece by piece, the plan was assembling itself. As Christmas approached, most people were wrapping gifts and planning family gatherings. Bruce was finishing preparations. He dyed parts of the Santa suit to make it more realistic. He tested the spray mechanism for the accelerant. He checked and rechecked the weapons. And he decided on a date, not chosen at random, but symbolic, a night defined by family tradition, a night where attendance was predictable, a night where trust would open the front door. On the morning of December 24th, Bruce didn't appear frantic or disturbed. Surveillance footage from stores showed him walking calmly, purchasing last-minute supplies. He spoke politely. He waited in line. He nodded to clerks. Nothing in his demeanor hinted that he was hours away from committing one of the most devastating mass killings tied to a domestic dispute in American history. There was no farewell note, no apology, no manifesto, because in his mind, the justification had already been sealed. Someone had taken from him. Now he would take everything in return. Hours before arriving at the Ortega home, he drove, not randomly, but along a route that matched pre-map coordinates found later among the belongings. He wasn't stalling. He wasn't debating. He was waiting for the exact hour when the most people would be present. The house was full. The celebration was underway. And Bruce knew exactly what he was walking into. During the investigation, one question hovered. Did anyone see hesitation? No. Neighbors recalled the exact opposite. One described him as walking with a pace that felt unnervingly steady. Another said he looked like a man going somewhere specific with purpose. There was no frantic energy, no visible anger. Just a man in a Santa suit, holding a wrapped box, approaching a house glowing with Christmas lights. And inside, the Ortega family continued laughing, unaware that their night and their lives were seconds away from changing forever. When detectives finished piecing together the timeline of Bruce's preparation, one line stood out in the final report summary. Nothing about this was spontaneous. Every purchase, every tool, every decision, every date, every detail was part of a plan built on resentment, not sudden rage. And that single realization made the crime even more chilling, because it meant he didn't lose control. He executed control. When the fire was finally extinguished and dawn crept over Covina, the scene outside the Ortega home didn't look like the remains of a holiday celebration. It looked like a battlefield where joy had been replaced by devastation. Smoke still drifted from the charred structure. Fire hoses lay coiled across the pavement, and police tape fluttered gently in the cold winter breeze. Vehicles sat abandoned in the driveway, wrapped gifts still visible through windows, untouched, unopened, and forever waiting. Officers, detectives, and federal agents worked their way through the debris, documenting evidence, marking remains, and recording injuries. Some of them paused, overcome, not because of what they saw, but because of what they understood. This wasn't an act of random violence. It was a massacre rooted in personal ties, family, and betrayal. 9 members of the Ortega family died that night. 3 others were critically injured, including the young girl who answered the door, the child who expected magic and innocence but met horror instead. She survived, but her life was forever split into a before and after. Investigators collected statements from fleeing neighbors who heard screams, sirens, and explosions. Some said the gunshots blended with Christmas music playing inside the house. Others said the fire's heat could be felt from the street. And over again, survivors repeated the same chilling sentence. Santa did this. While the fire investigators worked the scene, homicide detectives followed the trail leading away from the Ortega home, tracking Bruce Pardo's movements after he fled. The first major discovery was his rental car, abandoned outside his brother's house in Sylmar. The vehicle was suspiciously weighted, as if something heavy rested inside. When officers opened it, they quickly stepped back. Inside the trunk were additional ammunition, a second homemade incendiary device, materials that suggested further planned attacks, maps indicating possible secondary targets. One of those locations, Sylvia's divorce attorney. The plan wasn't meant to end with the Ortega family. In Bruce's mind, the list was longer. More people he believed were responsible for his humiliation. More destruction he intended to unleash. But the fire, the very weapon he built, changed everything. As detectives traced his next steps, they learned he didn't drive far after leaving Covina. Instead, he traveled directly to his brother's home, a place that once represented comfort. His brother wasn't there that night. Bruce sat alone inside the house, burned severely from his malfunctioning device. His Santa suit had fused the parts of his skin. His injuries weren't superficial. They were catastrophic, life-ending. Some investigators believed he hadn't intended to end his life yet, that the fire's backflash forced his decision, leaving him no escape. Either way, when officers entered the home hours later, they found Bruce's body on the floor, a handgun beside him. One final act of control. The case moved quickly, Not because there were unanswered questions, but because there was too much evidence pointing to one truth. This attack was deliberate, systematic, and premeditated. Search warrants executed at his residence revealed blueprints for the incendiary device, financial documents showing bankruptcy and overwhelming debt, court papers detailing child support disputes and resentment, receipts for the Santa costume and weapon modifications, a list of names, the Ortega family among them, highlighted and marked. Detectives and psychologists reviewing the material agreed on a heartbreaking pattern. Bruce didn't experience a sudden break. He built this destruction slowly, like a dark engineering project, validating his bitterness until it consumed every part of his life. Nothing about his behavior suggested remorse. Nothing suggested reconsideration, only intent. While investigators combed through Pardo's past, families across the country began waking up to the news headline no one could imagine. Man in Santa suit kills family on Christmas Eve. The world was stunned. Communities were shaken. Parents everywhere held their children closer. But for the Ortega family, this wasn't news. This was their life forever changed. Survivors spent days in hospital, not just recovering from burns or bullets, but from trauma. Police officers stood outside their rooms not for security, but for stability, as if preventing silence from becoming unbearable. Interviews were slow and cautious. Every detail offered helped reconstruct the timeline, but every memory carried weight. Some couldn't speak at all. Some spoke through tears. Some spoke with fury. But all of them said the same thing. They never believed he was capable of this. Within days, a memorial formed outside the ruins of the Ortega home. Flowers, candles, wrapped teddy bears, Christmas stockings with names written in marker, photos untouched by fire. People gathered silently, not because they knew the family personally, but because tragedy demanded acknowledgement. Pastors, counselors, and local leaders stepped forward. Covina was a close-knit community, and grief had spread through its streets like the fire itself. One neighbor said, "Christmas will never feel the same again." Another whispered, "How you explain something like this to a child?" No one had an answer. Because Bruce ended his own life, there was no trial, no sentencing, no opportunity for survivors to speak face-to-face with the man who destroyed their world. Instead, the justice system shifted to civil litigation, insurance claims, wrongful death filings, and legal processes that felt cold, mechanical, and painfully slow. Investigators released their official findings months later. No mental health diagnosis. No record of past violent behavior. No external trigger immediately before the attack. Just resentment, entitlement, obsession, and a systematic plan carried out with precision. The conclusion shocked no one, yet devastated everyone. The warning signs were subtle, private, and hidden behind normalcy. Years passed, but the story didn't fade. The Covina Christmas Eve Massacre became a case studied in law enforcement training, domestic violence intervention seminars, psychology programs on obsession and grievance-based violence, discussions on the dangers of untreated resentment and isolation. The case forced new conversations nationally about domestic violence, restraining orders, and the chilling truth. Violence isn't always loud before it erupts. Sometimes it waits, quietly, in someone convinced the world owes them something. On the anniversary of the tragedy, members of the Ortega family, those who survived and those born afterward, gathered at a small memorial garden built in the victim's honor. There were no presents, no decorations, no Santa imagery, just candles and names. A surviving daughter, now an adult, spoke softly while placing a white rose beside her mother's engraved plaque. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with strength. "He tried to take everything from us, but he failed. We still loved, we still gather, and we still live." She paused. People around her wiped tears. Then she added a sentence that echoed across the quiet space, a sentence that transformed tragedy into resilience. Evil ended that night, but family did not. Even today, experts still debate the same lingering question. What turns an ordinary person into someone capable of such destruction? Some say anger. Some say narcissism. Some say the refusal to accept loss. But the truth may be simpler and far more disturbing. Sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the one who breaks suddenly, but the one who plans to break you silently.